at a campaign rally in North Carolina. He began the rally by telling the only truth that he told tonight.
We have all night. We can have a lot of fun tonight. I have nothing to do. Nothing.
That is absolutely true. He is our first president with nothing to do. Because he has no idea what the president is supposed to do, and he is, of course, famously lazy, many of us said that when Donald Trump was running for president, that he didn't know anything about government. And now former Republican House Speaker Paul Ryan has said it in the new book, American Carnage. Paul Ryan said, "I'm telling you, he didn't know anything about government." Covering a Trump campaign rally presents challenges to the American news media because we know that the president is going to lie, that probably most of what he will say will be a lie. And we don't want to be the propaganda delivery system for his lies. But he is the president of the United States, and for all 44 of his predecessors, there has been a general societal agreement that what the president says is important. Now there is no general societal agreement about how to deal with what this president says. But we do have some new agreements tonight in new polling about what the president has been saying recently about 4 members of Congress who he has been attacking and who he attacked again tonight at his campaign rally. A new USA Today poll shows that 68% of Americans say that the president's attacks on those 4 women members of Congress are offensive. 59% of Americans say that those attacks are un-American. 65% of Americans say that telling 4 women of color to go back where they came from is a racist statement. The president struggled with the names of the Congresswomen he was attacking tonight. He admitted to being unable to say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's full name because it's just too long. He lied about all of the women, lied about them relentlessly tonight, claiming that they said things that they have not. In other words, it was a standard Donald Trump performance, kind of thing you've seen many times, filled with hatred and lies. But as with all such Trump performances, the most disturbing part of what happens at a Trump rally belongs to the Trump audience. It's what the Trump audience does and says. That Donald Trump is going to disgrace himself and now disgrace the presidency at his campaign rallies is to be expected. He's always done that. And sadly, it is just as likely that the Trump audience at the Trump event will disgrace themselves, as they did so fully tonight when they started chanting, "Send her back," when Donald Trump was telling them lies about Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. A new poll indicates that Donald Trump's support among Republicans has actually increased 5 points since he started attacking the 4 freshman Congresswomen, with attacks that 68% of Americans say are offensive, attacks that 59% of Americans say are un-American, attacks that 65% of Americans say are racist. 65% of Americans say that Donald Trump's attacks on these 4 Congresswomen are racist, and those racist attacks increase support for Donald Trump among Republican voters. And now they're chanting, "Send her back." Decorated combat hero and former Secretary of State John Kerry, who served in the war that Donald Trump avoided by getting a note from his doctor, wrote this today about Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who Donald Trump attacked again tonight. Ayanna Pressley served on John Kerry's Senate staff before he became Secretary of State. Of course, President Trump's comments about Representative Ayanna Pressley are racist, but even more revolting is his defense, pretending he's not attacking her race, but rather her lack of patriotism. Pressley's entire life has been a story of patriotism, loving her country so much that she wanted to help America live up to its ideals. A strong woman raised in public housing by a fearless mother who sacrificed to keep her safe. An activist who found in Boston a life of public service and a determination to speak up for people who were underrepresented. That story identifies as more American than any mantle this president could ever claim. No wonder Donald Trump is afraid of her. Leading off our discussion tonight are Leonard Pitts Jr., Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Miami Herald. His latest piece is entitled, "This Land is Our Land, Donald Trump." Also joining us, Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour and an MSNBC political analyst, and Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. He is a member of the Judiciary Committee and the Intelligence Committees. And Congressman Swalwell, let me start with you and what we saw on the House floor yesterday. You gave one of the most powerful statements on the floor yesterday before that vote to condemn what President Trump has been saying about your colleagues. I want to get your reaction to what he has continued to say and said tonight.
Good evening, Lawrence. You know, the trope, send them back, actually is one that our own government tells its employers across the federal agency. That is something you cannot say to an employee because it is racist. So that is something that our own government condemns. Second, we're going to send Donald Trump back. We're going to send him back to New York, whether it's through impeachment or election. And he's going to face swift, I predict, indictment and probably bankruptcy. And, you know, the question I've been asked the most across the country, particularly when I was running for president, is when will Republicans step up and do the right thing? And Lawrence, as someone who serves with so many of these individuals, I can tell you they are not. Donald Trump started this riot. Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and gang are the looters, and they are going to take everything. Tax cuts for the wealthy, a woman's right to choose, a worker's right to organize, until there's nothing left to take. And they're never going to stand up to him. We just have to beat them.
Leonard Pitts, I want to get your reaction tonight to the Trump crowd. We all know the Donald Trump show, the Donald Trump performance. We've all seen that before. But there's always another performance that's going on in that hall, at that event, at that rally, and that is the audience's performance. That's the Trump supporters' performance. And tonight, their choice was to chant, "Send her back." We may be hearing a lot of that kind of thing from these Trump crowds.
I don't know that we've ever stopped hearing those kinds of things from the Trump crowds. And frankly, I find it hard to look on what they said tonight with a whole lot of surprise, because it's consistent with the behavior of Trump's crowds at his rallies over the years since he first became a candidate for president and then president of the United States. These seem to be people who value their fear of this coming tide of progressive black and brown people, this rising change in American demographic. That's more important to them that be combated than health care, than diplomatic issues, than essentially anything that you can think of by which you would ordinarily judge a presidency. They're more concerned with protecting whiteness than they are with protecting America, and all you saw tonight was more of that.
Leonard, you made a point in your column that I found so striking about what Donald Trump doesn't understand about America and the populations and the people that it includes. He seems to think that Americans are only the people who look like members of his family. And you took this picture of America all the way up to Alaska to include some of the people up there who Donald Trump would never recognize as Americans.
Well, this whole idea of send them back, and this is something we kind of never discussed, but this whole idea of send them back is something that you can only say if we presuppose and we agree that you own the place. I'm in your studio now. If I say something that is displeasing, then you theoretically have the right to say, Leonard, you got to go, leave. But if we're in Walmart together, Walmart is a public space. You don't have the right to excise me from there. And what you see and hear in Donald Trump, and frankly in all the people that Donald Trump is echoing, is this presumption that as a white person, I have the right to judge your fitness and your right to be here in the United States of America. So we can argue with, and we should argue with, and we should decry the sentiment, but we should also note and decry the presumption that underlies the sentiment. You have no right to tell me where to go or where I can be. I am as American as anybody else in this country.
And Yamiche, 4 years ago, it was lock her up. Now it's send her back. And Ilhan Omar, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, tweeted tonight, "You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air, I'll rise." She was, of course, quoting Maya Angelou. We have a long presidential campaign ahead of us. Who knows what comes after? Send her back.
I think that what we saw tonight was the crystallization of President Trump trying to make these 4 congresswomen his foes for the 2020 campaign. The White House has been trying to make this pivot ever since Monday, when the president said over the weekend that these 4 congresswomen needed to go back to the countries from which they came, even though 3 of them were born in America and all of them are U.S. citizens. They've been trying to say, what he was trying to say really was that they should leave the country. But this crowd in North Carolina is being very clear that they heard Donald Trump loud and clear when he said over the weekend, and has been continued to say, that these women should go back to where they came from. So there's this idea that I think this crowd is giving us this a glimpse into the limits, really the non-limits that Trump supporters will go to follow this person that they now see as the person that's going to carry the torch for this new America, for going back to whatever America was years ago to make it great again. I think there's this idea that President Trump is very, very comfortable having these arguments about identity, really focusing his entire presidential campaign on racial politics, and on these racist tweets. And I think that what we see is the president saying today on the White House lawn, he said, "I think I'm winning this political battle." So he feels as though to get his supporters, which are largely white supporters, to get them animated and get them to turn out to the polls, he needs to have a foil in these women. Maybe he'll face Joe Biden, maybe he'll face Senator Harris, maybe he'll face Senator Sanders. But what he really wants to do is face these 4 women, because he's found that these 4 women can animate people better than anything he can say about policy.
Congressman Swalwell, I think Yamiche absolutely has it there. I think we can all agree on that, especially when you have the top polling Democratic candidates for president all now polling ahead of Donald Trump, all beating him in one-on-one polling. You are recently retired from the presidential campaign, back to your full-time job in the House. But look, I said to our staff tonight, I want to pull out any piece of the Donald Trump rally where he actually talks about a policy position of one of the Democratic presidential candidates in an intelligible way with English language sentences that can be followed. There is no such piece in the Trump rally tonight. Not one policy issue discussed in any way that you can make sense of by the president. But he spent 15 minutes on 4 freshman congresswomen.
Yeah. You know, Lawrence, I think this is going to be very much like the midterms. And when we look back on this point in history, we will probably find that the hardest thing we did was win the midterms to save the country. And the way we did that was to not go in the mud when Donald Trump, right before the midterm elections, was talking about immigration and these caravans. You know, I call them scaravans. He wanted that to be the top issue. And we told our candidates on the front lines, healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. They don't have a plan for healthcare. Their plan is subtraction. Our plan is addition. I don't think we have to deviate too far from that in 2020. They don't have a plan for healthcare. So, yes, he is racist. And by the way, he wants to take your healthcare.
Leonard Pitts, this poll coming out saying 65% of Americans think what the president said is racist, 65%. Is that an encouraging poll for you?
Not really, because I mean, we're a lot of times we're willing to say X, Y, and Z is racist, but the question that then has to be asked is, what weight does that carry with you if you're not an American of color? What are you willing to do about that? What are you willing to give up about that? What are you willing to say? What action are you willing to take? And on that account, I think, frankly, a lot of us as Americans have been remiss. The other number that gets pulled out, and you discussed it earlier, is that his popularity among his own party, among Republicans, has actually risen since those statements came out. And to me, that's a more telling number, because what it says is that, contrary to all of the talk a year, 2 years ago, that he was driven by, and that they were driven by economic anxiety and populism and all the rest of the stuff. It codifies the fact that what we're seeing here is nothing more and nothing less than an appeal to white nationalism that is being soaked up, that is finding a home in a frighteningly large number of people. 63 million Americans in the last election voted for this knowing what it was. That's the number that stops me. That's the number that I think should give us all pause.
Yamiche, what do you expect from the president's campaign now that they see a 5-point bump among Republicans in his favorability as a result of these attacks?
What we can expect is the campaign to continue to use these 4 women as examples of what they see as what's wrong with American politics. They want to run this campaign and want to give a face to the Democratic Party. And Joe Biden possibly being a moderate, possibly being someone who can capture states like Pennsylvania, maybe Michigan, or someone like Senator Harris or other people, that they're not in some ways more radical enough in their minds to really make the case. So I think what we're going to see is President Trump and his campaign continuing to make the case that they understand that American identity is really tied to what the president sees as his way forward. And his way forward is going to be talking about race in this way, talking about these young women, or these congresswomen, I should say, rather, and attacking them. And I think that the president has really settled on the idea that race and immigration animates people more than policies. And that's how he won in 2016. That's how he wants to win in 2020.
Yamiche Alcindor, Leonard Pitts, Congressman Swalwell, thank you all for starting us off.
My pleasure.
Tonight.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Thank you all. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.